the last couple of slides that I have here are actually going to be just a practical application of operant conditioning. So before we get into it, I want to make a note that this isn't something that I'm going to test you on the specific details of. I'm not going to ask you specifics about black-capped chickadees or a specific chickadee experiment. I just want you to use this as an example of how we could use operant conditioning in an actual research setting. So this is just another example, and I'm not going to test from this where you have to memorize anything about chickadees or my experimental setup. I just want to give it to you guys as a bit of flavor so you can actually see this stuff at work. And so on that note, in case you're not familiar with them, black-capped chickadees are small songbirds that we have all across North America. They look like this, very short and fat, very fluffy. They're only about 12 to 15 grams, so they're very, very small. They are monomorphic, meaning that the males and the females look very similar to one another. And we can tie that back to an earlier chapter because these guys are mostly monogamous, so there isn't any major male-male competition or female-female competition. So they look pretty much the same, and they both take care of their young and rear them together. They're also very interesting because they're vocal learners. And vocal learners are a specific series of groups of animals that actually learn their vocalizations, hence the name. But the coolest part is that songbirds are one of a very limited group of species that can actually do this. Humans are another one, the one that's been most extensively studied, because the way that we acquire and use language is very specific and particular. We have to learn how to speak by listening to and mimicking our parents, so we listen to a model, somebody else of our species, and we copy and we learn over time. And the chickadees do the same. And for those of you who are interested, elephants will do the same, whales, sea lions, bats, and parrots, I believe, all also fall under that blanket of vocal learners. But most other species, their vocalizations are going to be innate, meaning that they know them from birth and they tend not to change them or adjust them as they get older. All right, so that is a lot about vocal learners and chickadees. But all that we really care about is that these guys produce vocalizations and they're really good at listening to their own vocalizations. Kind of like how humans are specialized to listen to human speech. Same goes for chickadees and most other species. And so for some of the research questions that we can ask, these are just a couple that have popped up in the lab that I work in the past couple of years. So we have asked, can chickadees tell if vocalizations are male or female produced? So could a chickadee tell that a vocalization that they hear was produced by a male, or can they tell if it's produced by a female? Could they tell the difference? Could they form, say, a category of male calls versus female calls? We've also asked, do chickadees treat predator calls and mobbing calls or alarm calls made specifically for those predators very similarly? And interestingly, they kind of do, not quite, but if they hear a predator and if they hear one of their own kind react to that same kind of predator, we will see the same sort of behavior in response. Same as when we had talked about, say, our meerkats having an alarm response, the chickadees will do something very similar. But more research is still being done. And the last question that I've asked recently is, does anthropogenic noise, or human-produced noise, interfere with chickadees' ability to discriminate between calls? Basically, I'm asking, does anthropogenic or human-produced noise make it harder for these birds to communicate with each other? And the answer so far seems to be that it is influencing their behavior. It's changing how they're eating and when they're eating, but we're still looking into how it affects their communication specifically. But lots of varied and various studies that you can do, and most of these have actually been set up using operant conditioning, which is why we're talking about them today. All right. So if we're going to be asking these questions, so we're going to use the first one as our example, where I had asked, can chickadees tell male and female produced vocalizations apart? And so if we're going to ask a bird, is that a male or is that a female? You can't do it the way we would ask humans. You can't just ask them, is it male or female? So instead we have to make a couple of assumptions. And we're going to do this using what's called categorization. And so we're going to ask, instead of, is this a male or is this a female? We're going to ask, do the birds treat all male calls the same? And do they treat those male calls differently from female calls? Or do they treat all types of calls, all male and female produced calls, the same? So we're basically asking is, do they group all of the male calls together and all of the female calls together? Or do they only care about calls in general and sex doesn't matter to them? So these are our two options that we wanted to look at. And so if that's our question, we of course then want to create two different categories of stimuli. We're going to have male and female calls because we want to present the birds with male and female calls. And to ask our question, we actually have to have the birds make some kind of response. So far we've talked about rats and having rats press a lever. That's one form of responding. In this case, we're going to use something a little bit different, but I will come back to that with a diagram in just a little bit. But with our categories, our male calls versus our female calls, we want them to be different. We want them to be rewarded or reinforced different from each other. And so the fancy way of saying that is using differential reinforcement. And all that means is that one category would be rewarded. They would get access to food. They'd get that positive reinforcement. Our other category is going to be unrewarded. In this case, we turn the lights out so they don't get food, and we give them a signal that says that you didn't do the right thing. And so we can have, say, male calls are our rewarded calls. And so if they make a response, like a rat pressing a lever, when they hear a male call, they would get rewarded and they'd get access to food. So they learn that male calls are good, they produce a good outcome, so they learn that the response of pushing the lever, or as we'll see in a minute, making another response, when a stimulus of a male call is present, gets them a good outcome, that access to food. And if this is our rewarded category for males, then females are our unrewarded category. So if the stimulus of a female call is heard and they make that response, they're pushing their lever, then the lights turn out and they don't get food. So it's not a good outcome, and so they're not going to want to make that response again. So with this differential reinforcement, we see a response to our male calls and no response to our female calls if they can learn to tell the difference between male and female calls. All right, and so that kind of brings us to this idea of, if the categories that we've created, this male calls versus female calls, if those categories match a category that the birds can use, something that they conceptualize in their brains, then we could see some things happening in our results. So if it's a real category, something that the birds can use on their own, they should learn to discriminate or respond differentially faster if it's a real category. So if all male calls are good is something that they can learn, and they know that male calls all fit in one category and those male calls get rewarded, they're going to learn, go to male calls or don't respond to female calls, and that's going to learn a lot faster than if there weren't categories to begin with. If we just presented them with a whole bunch of vocalizations, then they couldn't use a category a general rule of male calls are good and female calls are not, they'd instead have to memorize each individual call, which chickadees are stubborn enough and good enough with vocalizations that they will do it, but it takes them longer than if they can just use a shortcut rule like all male calls are good. So they would learn faster if they're using the categories that we think they're learning. That's our first check that they're doing what we think they're doing. The second thing that we can do is see if they're able to transfer or apply what they learned to new vocalizations. So if we teach these birds that male calls are good and female calls are not, if we give them new male calls that they haven't heard before, they should still think that those new male calls are good and new female calls are not, because they match up with the categories that they've already learned. So we get these two different ways that we can actually test that our results are telling us what we think they're telling us. And so now here's where I'm going to get into our responding. And I think I've let it slip just a couple of times because we've so far only really used lever pressing or button pressing. And so a lever press or a button push are two different types of responding. And we can look at broad categories of responding. And so you can have something like a rat is faced with two buttons and they have to choose between pushing the purple button or the blue button. So that would be called a forced choice discrimination. So they pick, should they press purple or should they press blue? And so maybe purple is our female vocalizations and blue is our male vocalizations. And if we're using our rule that female vocalizations aren't good, but male vocalizations are good, then they should probably push the blue button to get a reward. If you're thinking it through, a vocalization is very difficult to hear two of at the same time. So if you were told to choose between two sounds, you couldn't really hear both of them at the same time. What we would use instead for sounds is what's called a go or no-go response. So you push the button if it's the right thing, or you don't push the button if it's the wrong thing. So if we use the same thing where blue is a male call and purple is a female call, we would say purple is not the thing I get rewarded for, so I won't push that button. Because if I push it, I don't get rewarded, so I'm not doing it. I'm making a no-go response to the purple. But for the blue, that's a male call, and I've learned that male calls are good, so I will push the blue button. I will make a go response. And so button pressing or lever pressing is what we've used so far, but I believe I've mentioned in the class that chickadees don't do well with buttons. Their beaks aren't strong enough for them to push a button consistently, so it's a little bit easier for us to use a setup kind of like this here. And so this is going to be one of our operant boxes, and it's kind of confusing to look at to begin with, but we have our cage here, the light that lights up the box. This perch that the bird is sitting on is called a request perch, and it just has an infrared beam that tells a computer that the bird is sitting there and that they're ready to participate in the next experiment. And then over here we have our feeder, and the bird can fly into this feeder, and when they do, they break more infrared beams that again tell the computer that the bird is now in the feeder. If the bird makes a response, in this case, they're going to fly into that feeder after they hear a sound. So there isn't a button to push, there's no lever to press. For our chickadees, what they do is they sit on this perch, they listen to a sound that comes out of the speaker. If it's a male sound, and that's the good category, then the bird should fly into the feeder. The computer will say that, yes, you've flown to the feeder, and this little scribble at the bottom is actually just a cup of food, and that'll rise up so that the bird can have access to food because they made the right choice. if the bird is sitting on this perch and they hear a female call, and we said that female calls are not rewarded, so if the bird flies over to the feeder when they heard the call that they're not supposed to respond to, the one that they should do a no-go response, then instead of having the food cup rise, because it's the wrong thing to do, the light goes out so that they know they did the wrong thing, and then they can start again. So a go response is to go into the feeder. If they go into the feeder and it was to a good sound, the food cup rises and they get rewarded. If they go in the feeder and it was not a good sound, then the light turns out and they don't get any food. So our stimulus is going to be the sound that plays from the speaker. Our response is flying into the feeder. And our outcome is going to be whether the food cup rises or not. And so that's a whole bunch of different setups, but what I'm going to do now is, again, show you guys a video that'll actually show you what's going on in the box when this happens. And so in this case, we're going to have a camera that's looking through the back of the feeder. And so you're going to be looking at all of this from a different angle, but you're going to be looking across the feeder and into the body of the cage. So you'll see the bird in front of you on their perch, you can hear the sound from the speaker next to you, and then at the bottom of the screen, you'll be able to watch the food cup rise when it's supposed to. And so I'm going to jump ahead because there's a whole bunch of explanation at the beginning here. Okay, so we're going to start with a correct go response. So the bird hears a male call and is going to go to the feeder, make that response, and the outcome is that they get food. So we'll let that play now. All right, so you saw the bird sit on the perch, they heard the stimulus, they made their response, and they got their reward, the outcome at the end. So our next trial is going to be a no-go response. So this is what happens when the bird hears a female call and should not go to the feeder because that's not the response that gets them food. So the correct thing for the bird to do is to not do anything, to waste some time, so they can hop around their cage and wait for the next trial. Perfect. So they hopped around, they didn't go into the feeder, they didn't make that incorrect response, and so nothing happened. And then for this trial, they're calling it punishment. It depends on how you frame these things, which is why I haven't used that term yet. I forgot it was a title. But basically, this is our incorrect response to a stimulus. So they hear a female call, and they're not supposed to go to the feeder because that's not the right thing to do, but they do it anyways, and then the lights turn out. Lovely. All right. So those are the 3 types of responding. And so again, I want to reiterate that this section on black-capped chickadees isn't something that I'm going to test you strenuously on. I'm not going to ask you the specifics about how to set up a chickadee experiment or what kinds of questions I've asked. I just want you to see it as an example of how you could set up an operant experiment. So if I described an operant experiment, would you be able to identify the stimulus and the response and the outcome similar to how we walked through a real-life example here? So don't worry about memorizing information about chickadees or go, no-go experiments like this. Just know the different terminology that we focused on during the lecture and take this as an extended example plus a little bit of exposure into how research can work in the real world.